Hello, everyone. Welcome to this cash webinar on looking abroad for alternative ways of resolving disputes in the private rental sector. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Today we've got Dr. Jennifer Harris speaking, who's a senior research associate at the University of Bristol, and she's going to be talking about the recent cash project output she recently completed on looking at alternative means of dispute resolution in the private rental sector, both within the UK and internationally. This is part of a 3-year project, which is funded by the Dispute Service and Safe Deposits Scotland, and the overarching purpose of the 3-year programme is to re-establish in the private rental sector, but the project is UK-wide and it also covers quite a range of areas. There's already been one report published on the Cash website looking at the private rental sector by Ken Gibb and Alex Marsh. We encourage you to look at that. And this is another part of the project which Jennifer's been working on, which she's going to talk about. The way this report can be structured is I'm going to quickly pass over to Jennifer. Jennifer's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And I'd encourage you to submit questions throughout process. So you can do that if you hover your mouse, and at the bottom of the screen you'll see a chat box. And if you click that chat box and message everyone, then we'll be able to see your questions. And then I'm going to kind of collect all these questions, both that have been submitted both during and adapt the presentation, and I'm going to pose them to Jennifer. We're going to have a bit of a talk afterwards. This webinar is being recorded, so if you don't wish your name to appear in the private chat, then please, you can use the private function if you want to talk to us. If you want to talk to me directly, you can. I think that's all from me for now. So I'm going to pass over to Jennifer, who's going to talk about the project.
Great, thank you, Chris. So today I'm going to start by briefly summarising the main options that are currently available for resolving landlord and tenant disputes in the private rented sector. I'll explain what do we mean by alternative dispute resolution, briefly summarise the project that I've been working on, and the main focus of today's talk will be on 3 international case studies where ADR has been used to address housing disputes. And from that, we'll discuss what some of the key learning is, key principles are that we could use in the UK to improve dispute resolution. So, and of course, we know disputes can occur in any consumer market, but in the private rented sector, they can have quite particularly harsh consequences. So homelessness, loss of a home. So it's essential that there is an adequate system for resolving disputes so landlords and tenants can assert their legal rights, access justice, and disagreements can be resolved. Now, there is a diverse dispute resolution landscape, both within and outside of the courts and tribunals. However, this landscape is very complex, it's very confusing, it often does not assist landlords and tenants in the private rented sector. So in each nation of the UK, there is an adjudicatory service offered by the tenancy deposit schemes for disputes related to deposits, but for disputes on other issues such as rent, disrepair, and so forth, landlords and tenants often have no means of resolving disputes other than through courts and tribunals, although there is some inconsistency there as well. So in England and Wales, if you rent through a letting agent and you have a dispute, yes, you will have an access to a redress scheme, either the property redress scheme or the property ombudsman. But if you rent directly from a landlord, you won't have access to a redress scheme. So your only options are the courts or the tribunals. But we know that tenants, and particularly non-professional landlords, can be quite reluctant to resort to formal judicial proceedings. Numerous barriers exist, sort of lack of knowledge or understanding of rights or entitlements, limited access to advice or assistance, or fear of attending court. Now, We know that tribunals were originally envisioned as offering a quicker, easier way of resolving cases that don't need to go to court. But there's been a recent qualitative study of the first-tier tribunal in England, which showed that whilst it's generally well regarded by users, particularly non-professional landlords and tenants can fail to appreciate the difference between a court and tribunal. That tribunals can still feel quite daunting and quite court-like. And in Scotland, whilst like many of the recent reforms in the private rented sector, the tribunal, the first-tier tribunal, is still in its early stages. We don't quite have enough evidence to assess its impact, but nonetheless, some key stakeholders that we consulted with for this study did report that continuing complexity may act as a deterrent to accessing the tribunal. So to apply to the tribunal in Scotland, you have to submit a specific application form for the issue under dispute. So there's 49 separate applications linking to different bits of legislation. So that's just one example of how sort of the initial stages of launching a dispute might still be quite difficult, particularly for more vulnerable claimants. So tribunals don't offer necessarily a straightforward solution. Many landlords and tenants face barriers to resolve disputes. So across the UK, governments have either introduced legislation or announced legislative measures, policy developments to dispute resolution for landlords and tenants. So there's increasingly there's questions being raised. Actually, are tribunals and courts the best setting to resolve disputes in this context? In England, they've the MHCLG has announced that compulsory membership with the redress scheme will be extended to all private landlords. They want to develop a single point of access for all redress schemes. In Scotland, visitors to the Resolving Rented Housing Dispute section of the MyGov website are actually advised going to the tribunal, I quote, going to the first-tier tribunal to solve a problem can be quite stressful. It's best to find another solution. So there is, and the website does provide information on mediation and arbitration. In Northern Ireland, the Department for Community has discussed plans to develop an independent housing panel, and they very recently funded a pilot mediation service, which is being run by the organisation Housing Rights. In Wales, when the Renting Home Act comes into force, all rental contracts will be standardised, and within there should be a statement of what tenants should do in order to resolve disputes. The government told me that there are plans to develop a website with all contractual terms to improve knowledge of rights and entitlements. And yes, information and advice is a very important piece of the puzzle, but whether it's by itself sufficient is a question I'll come on to later. So increased interest in reforming dispute resolution, interest in ADR. What is ADR? So alternative dispute resolution refers to a range of processes that allow, in this context, landlords and tenants a means of resolving disputes outside courts and tribunals. When people think of ADR, they generally think of mediation, but actually, as you can see on this slide, there's a wide range of different processes available. A distinction can be made between determinative techniques. These generally involve a third party, so a judge, an ombudsperson, and they'll generally be decisions that are legally supported. Can be contracted in order to reach an agreement, reach a resolution by an agreement. So yes, there's policy developments in this area, but we don't know much about how it's actually operating in the private rented sector context. You know, where does it actually exist? What are its strengths? What are its limitations? What's the evidence base? How can it be improved? Those are some of the questions we look to address in our research project. And what I want to talk today about is particularly the third research question we pose, which is what are some of the principles and approaches which could be applied to the UK to facilitate landlord and tenant dispute resolution. So in order to answer that question, one of the things we did was look at some international examples of where ADR has been used to address housing disputes. just before I move on to discuss these case studies, I just want to draw your attention to where ADRs are already operating in the private rented sector context. So this is primarily in the forms of, first of all, court or tribunal connected mediation. So the pre-action protocols for disrepair cases in England and Wales state that landlords and tenants should attempt to resolve disputes prior to court action. So, for example, by considering the use of ADR. In Scotland, the tribunal doesn't offer any in-house mediation service. It won't recommend any other services either. But it is presented as a sort of a division first. So where cases are identified by the chamber president as potentially suitable for mediation, the tribunal needs to make parties aware that it is an alternative means of resolving disputes. Now, nonetheless, one of the things that came out in our study was that in practice, while sort of these provisions exist sort of in principle, in practice, mediation very rarely, or in general really, mediation very rarely plays a role in resolving disputes in the private rented sector that don't relate to deposits. Generally, quite crucially, and I'll come back to this later, it's only available once a case has been filed. So once the case has been presented to the tribunal or court, then mediation is suggested as an alternative. But at that point, what we have is two parties that have begun to craft their claims in unequivocally adversarial terms. So expecting people to sort of detach from that approach can be quite tricky. Often people kind of might just want to have it out. Whilst there are a considerable number of private mediators that operate across the UK, and indeed there's a fair number of voluntary services that address disputes between neighbours, actually there's a lack of public funding or provision for mediation services or ADR services that address landlord and tenant disputes specifically. Private mediator fees is likely to be beyond the reach of many people living in the private rented sector. And just the other main form of ADR that's operating in the private rented sector is the adjudicatory service offered by the tenancy deposit schemes and ombud services. So ombud services can employ lots of different types of ADR mechanisms, but the ones that are operating in the UK private rented sectors generally use adjudication as the primary mechanism, often as part of a multi-tiered process, which does prioritise sort of early resolution and so forth, which I'll come on to. So in adjudication, and it's important because it's in the case studies as well, landlords and tenants both will submit their evidence. This is sent to an independent and impartial adjudicator. They'll review that evidence and then they'll make a decision. However, these providers, as I mentioned before, only address certain aspects of housing issues. Significant gaps in the dispute resolution landscape remain. So, to explore how dispute resolution in this context could possibly be improved, we looked at 3 international case studies. Now, of course, due to the complexity of different legal systems, we can't assume that one model will necessarily operate well or be easily transferable to a UK context. But as, however, I'll go on to discuss, these models apply certain principles or certain approaches that reflect key lines of arguments in the ADR literature on best practice in resolving disputes. So by sort of looking at the case studies, looking at what the literature says as best practice, we can draw out sort of key principles, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So the first case study I want to show you is the Civil Resolution Tribunal, which operates in British Columbia in Canada. It's an online administrative tribunal that's been operating since 2016. It addresses small claim disputes and condominium owner disputes. So before this was developed, the only means of resolving disputes, for example, between two neighbours, was to file a complaint to the Superior Court. Research demonstrated that the civil justice system in Canada, like here, posed numerous access barriers, failed to provide adequate dispute resolution. So this led to the creation of the CRT. it provides, so it's unique in the sense in that it provides a dispute resolution system that uses different ADR processes to resolve housing disputes entirely via digital channels. For those unable to engage with these digital processes, paper system is provided. So it's an end-to-end dispute resolution system. There's 4 key processes. Disputants are encouraged to sort of move through it in a linear fashion. There are some means to bypass different stages, but generally you kind of start with stage 1. Now, what stage 1 is? It's an information tool called Systems Explorer. So it uses a very simple question and answer format to help people to diagnose the problem. So it's designed so that people can come to this website with 2 questions. 1, what is my problem? 2, how do I solve it? So there's this question and answer format. There's sort of this progress bar along the side of the screen that shows people, you know, how much more there is to go. You can save it, you can come back to it later. When you've come to the end of that process, there's a summary report which is presented. It gives guidance. So it says, it provides users with some tools, so letter templates or worksheets to calculate damages, suggestions of how they can resolve the problem themselves. If that's not sort of sufficient, if they can't solve the problem with the information that's been given, they go to step 2. Now, this is this provides the two parties a means to communicate with each other using online, telephone, and paper-based channels. So there's very limited intervention from CRT staff there. And the aim is to resolve some of the more easy disputes relatively early and inexpensively. If the dispute, if it's unsuccessful or one party is unwilling to engage in that process, they then enter the 3rd stage. Now this is a felicitation stage, excuse me, where staff with mediation skills and experience will support parties to reach an agreement through different channels, so through phone, email, text, video conferencing, and so forth. Now, the final stage is an independent tribunal where a decision is made regarding to the dispute. So both the facilitated agreements and the adjudicated decisions can be enforced like a court order. Now, this key here at the bottom illustrates the significant number of cases which are resolved before the adjudication stage, indicated by this dispute volumes grey box here. So whilst there's not been an independent evaluation of the CRT yet, the system metrics showed that, I think it was in the first year or so, 68,000 solution explorers at this stage, 11,000 moved on to the next stage. So a significant number were sort of resolved through self-help tools. So, and I want to move on to talk about show you another case study. So this is Tenancy Services in New Zealand. Tenancy Services is an independent judicial body that provides dispute resolution for landlords and tenants in the private rented sector where there's been a breach of the tenancy agreement. It also provides a multi-stage dispute resolution service. So again, at the first stage, they're encouraged to resolve the dispute amongst themselves through the provision of online information. If an agreement is reached, the landlord can apply to have this formalized through a fast-track resolution stage. If an agreement is not reached, then either the landlord or tenant can give the other party 14 days notice to resolve the problem. If the problem's not resolved, then an application can be made to the tribunal. That includes the option of participating in telephone or face-to-face mediation. So, and participation in mediation is voluntary, but the tribunal has the power to halt proceedings and say, you know, why don't you try out mediation first? The last available data suggests that the tenancy service does perform well in providing quite a timely dispute resolution process. This is, you know, one of the key points of sort of ADR. It's supposed to offer sort of quicker means of resolving disputes, and 83% of the mediations took place within 10 days of the application being made. So that's fairly good figures there. And 44% of the cases referred to the tribunal were actually resolved through mediation. quite high levels of satisfaction as well, consistent with the international literature on mediation. People would, so 83% of people surveyed were satisfied with the service. There is, however, one key issue here, in that in order to access mediation, people have to put in an application to the tribunal. So in New Zealand, there's quite a culture of mediation. People are generally aware of what it is, that it's available. And it's generally sort of more widely accepted than perhaps here, than what's the case here. But one interview participant that I spoke with said, partly because of this, people don't necessarily want to put an application in the tribunal. Some just want to, they want to try mediation first. And that's further compounded by sort of that all decisions made by the tribunal are published online, and they're not anonymous. So a landlord can actually search if a potential tenant has previously raised a dispute. So this can act as a key deterrent for accessing the tribunal. The third example I want to show you is the Residential Tenancies Board in the Republic of Ireland. So the Residential Tenancies Board was established in 2004 to provide both a national register of private landlords and a dispute resolution to provide landlords and tenants a means of resolving disputes outside of courts and trial. It deals with a wide range of disputes, so breaches of tenancy obligations, claims for costs, damages, rents disputes. Again, offers a multi-stage dispute resolution process, offering two forms of ADR, sort of mediation and adjudication. Generally, those landlords and tenants are expected to attempt one of the ADR mechanisms first, but in some exceptional circumstances, they might be referred directly to the tribunal. So if there's a very serious dispute or a threat to life, for example. So as with the other two case studies, people are initially encouraged to resolve the dispute amongst themselves. There's information provided on the website on rights and responsibilities, on preventing disputes. And this is something that's been increasingly prioritized by the RTB, the creating sort of a one-stop shop. That's their aim, for people to access the advice and information they need. And at this stage, they're also increasingly engaging in early resolution techniques. And they'll try at this stage to communicate sort of on a more informal basis with parties to attempt to achieve early resolution. In 2018, 1,500 cases were withdrawn following that sort of early resolution, that early intervention. So if landlords and tenants are unable to resolve the disputes amongst themselves, they can choose either mediation or adjudication. And statistics suggest that rates of settlement are again quite consistent with international literature. So I think in 2015, 75% of cases heard via telephone mediation resulted in agreement. So, and again, where an agreement can't be reached or an adjudicator's decision is rejected, the dispute can be referred to the tribunal. So, and they can issue a binding determination order. So what can we learn from these different case studies? So the benefits of a multi-tiered dispute resolution system. So a 2 or 3 step process, often with mediation preceding more formal forms of adjudication was common with these case studies. And the performance data from each of the services suggests that a more participatory or facilitated negotiated process, such as mediation, can result in a significant number of cases being resolved before formal proceedings. So the benefits of having a wide range of ADR options available is cited quite widely in the literature, and the creativity, the flexibility that ADR offers is arguably one of its greatest strengths. So a multi-tiered system can allow procedures to be tailored to individual cases and can help to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach that is often associated with formal justice proceedings, which can exclude and alienate parties. The case studies suggest that there may be significant advantages associated with offering a consensual form of ADR before a dispute moves into formal litigation procedures. So rather than attaching it to a pre-existing dispute resolution process, so added on to adversarial court processes or tribunal processes, it's available earlier. So we can't directly compare or contrast sort of a court or tribunal linked mediation service and those provided out of court or tribunal sort of before a dispute escalates. But feedback from key stakeholders suggests that when people initially frame their cases in adversarial terms, it can be quite difficult for them to detach from this approach and consider another way of addressing the dispute. The case studies illustrate the importance of the flexibility of the system and the way in which people move through the pathway. So we think about what cases, if any, might go straight to a tribunal. And the New Zealand case study really illustrates that where there's inflexibility within the system, then key access barriers can remain. So in formal litigation procedures, you know, very much the judge sort of makes the decision, the lawyer decides what the key legal issues are, and the disputing parties may actually have relatively little control over the process. So the case studies not only focus on sort of resolving disputes at the earliest opportunity, they can be seen to embrace a philosophy which encourages parties to become active participants in the dispute resolution process, very much so by providing a self-resolution stage. So in the literature, one of the key benefits that is of ADR is this kind of contribution to a sense of empowerment, the ability to help to enhance an individual's voice and choice. Evidence indicates that where parties have had a greater role to play in resolving the dispute, this can result in a greater commitment to the solution because they've actually had a role in helping to determine what that solution is. The case studies illustrate that the information can come in different forms. So not only just static online information stages, actually there's guided pathways using question and answer formats, sort of video explanation, pages that adjust the content depending on who's using them, or a chat box that pops up and as you progress through the different pages. And actually they show that human interaction can continue to play some limited role within this process. What all the case studies also illustrate is that for some problems, information alone is likely to be insufficient. And each case study provides alternative options for problems that can't be resolved through self-resolution alone. So if I was to approach a particular sort of government or nation, say, you know, how are you going to improve dispute resolution for landlords and tenants? And the only sort of answer was, we're going to enhance information, the availability of advice and information, I would question if that was sufficient by itself. In terms of the case studies, another key learning is sort of proportionate and appropriate dispute resolution. These are terms that are used quite widely within the sort of ADR and dispute resolution literature. And what the case studies illustrate is a system where courts and tribunals do actually continue to play a key role, but rather than being the first or only means of resolving a dispute, they're positioned as the last resort. Appropriate dispute resolution also means that the process required to resolve a case will vary according to the sort of the needs of the parties and the dispute at hand. So in the case studies, the resources, the service involvement, the staff expertise, the cost, the time taken in each stage is designed to sort of escalate and reflect the nature and complexity of individual cases. And in the same way, the effort that, required from the disputants, sort of submitting details of the disputes, receiving information, particularly in the British Columbia case, that's also designed to escalate, to progress as people move through the pathway. So it's not giving everybody all the information at once, but rather just what they need at that stage. So in this sense, the system can be seen as aiming to provide a response that's proportionate to the needs and complexities of different cases. Having a wider range of mechanisms could contribute to the overall proportionality of the system, because it can remove access barriers so people are able to bring a case at proportionate costs. And finally, well, not every dispute will be resolved or will be appropriate for ADR, so an adjudicatory stage is necessary. And that's also within the literature. It says, it emphasized that if access to justice is to be upheld, binding conflict resolution should be available as an accessible alternative. What this also does, it provides reassurance that one way or another, the dispute will be resolved. And then the final key principle, or key learning from the case studies, is this idea of a user-focused approach. So the literature suggests that what we need to be doing is assessing and developing and improving systems, not from the perspective of judges or lawyers, but rather from the perspective of people who will be using the system, and really put them at the heart of the design process. And that's particularly important in the development of online processes. So all these case studies used sort of technology in those systems. The British Columbia provides an example of a system that's been fully digitized. And there is literature, the literature does suggest that moving dispute resolution online can potentially lead to sort of faster, cheaper, more transparent processes, more accessible justice. But often what happens is when e-government initiatives are pursued, this happens without sort of actually examining people's everyday experiences of using and engaging with technology. And the same can be actually said for some of the, these dispute resolution processes as well. So how often are court or tribunal forms actually designed in collaboration with people who will be using them? And where this has not been taken into consideration, there are then risks of excluding people. So excluding people that might have hearing or visual impairments, mental health issues, literacy issues, and many more. So the literature does say that it does show that the accessibility of a digital system, the accessibility indeed of these dispute resolution systems will depend on the extent to which sort of different abilities, uses, barriers faced by different groups of users have been thought about and have been incorporated into the system's design. And this was, British Columbia provides an example of where this, I would say, this really took place. They intentionally tried to focus on who would be using the technology and sought to accommodate and respond to the diverse needs of people by two key processes, because actually on a practical level, adopting a user-focused approach really isn't that difficult. It involves two key processes. It involves vigorous user testing with two key groups. So say with people that are going to be using these systems, and for the organizations that are supporting them. And if this principle was perhaps in place when we were designing universal credit, we wouldn't be in the mess we are now. So, and indeed focusing on users should be an ongoing and continuous process. You can't always predict what the different challenges or barriers will be. So you just kind of need to constantly revisit it and be flexible, willing to adapt and adjust the system as sort of these different challenges arise. So in conclusion, I would say what I would argue is that we need to a shift away from treating dispute resolution in the private renter sector as the exclusive domain of courts and tribunals. So whilst the small number of people who are accessing courts or tribunals might suggest that other informal mechanisms are working, actually evidence suggests that this is not the case. So very few people actually approach the local authorities for assistance, and overstretched and under-resourced environmental health teams struggle as it is to respond to the complaints that they receive. So what we really need is an improved system for resolving disputes in the private renter sector. And whilst I've talked about mediation quite a bit today, and I'm happy to answer some questions on that topic, the report doesn't actually advocate for one particular ADR mechanism, but rather suggest that what we need is a wider range of processes that can meet the needs and complexities of different types of cases. So ADR needs to be thought of not just as mediation, but as a range of processes. You know, that if you think back to the slide I showed you earlier, there's, you know, lots of different options available. Each procedure offers different advantages, different disadvantages, and each can be adapted to different types of cases. So, you know, to improve dispute resolution in the UK private rented sector, ADR should not only be available in the form of court or tribunal connected mediation, but perhaps rather it needs to be seen more as an essential part of the justice system, as indeed it is in other areas of disputes and other areas of law. And, you know, given that courts and tribunals are likely to be inappropriate for many landlord and tenant disputes, we need mechanisms available for them to be resolved before they escalate to courts or tribunal processes, or before they escalate to possession proceedings. You know, and really, I think what our report does is suggest that we need to think slightly, maybe a bit more creatively about the different principles and processes, or principles and approaches through which dispute resolution is designed and developed. You know, the private rented sector, as we all know, is changing and developing rapidly, and we need a dispute resolution landscape that's able to, you know, to meet these changes and you know, lots of people come to the dispute resolution system with different characteristics, with different needs, with different abilities, different problems, you know, and rather than having sort of like a one-size-fits-all traditional justice system that we expect all these different types of people and all these different types of problems to fit within, maybe we should challenge ourselves to develop a system that's actually able to adapt to, you know, this changing housing context and the different challenges and experiences of people that you know, live and work within it. So that's me done. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Jennifer. It was really good. So there's quite a few questions in the group chat. As you mentioned, my internet connections are slightly unstable at times. I'm at home, so I think as I imagine everyone else is. So if I do cut off, Jennifer, could you? There's questions in the group chat, so if you click in the chat, you'll see the questions. And so if you could feel the questions yourself, if I do cut off, then that's much appreciated.
Okay, I'll give it a go.
That can be okay. So the first I just want to ask you a quick factual question before going into the details. So there's a question from Helen Hudson, who asks who pays for these schemes in the three schemes that you did in the international review.
So all the schemes are government funded, so I'm assuming out of general taxation, but each of them also do have very small fees attached, but they tend to be quite low. I think the tenancy tribunals in the Republic of Ireland is something like, I think, €15, you know, submitted by online, or 30 euros if submitted by paper. There's a small fees as well, I think, in British Columbia, which can be waived for people that can't afford to pay it. But, you know, the head of you know, the whole idea, I guess, behind these systems is that they should, in the long run, actually have cost saving potential. So the head of the CRT in British Columbia reports that by moving dispute resolution online, the government expects to save $2.5 million in legal system resources, which then can be allocated. So I know it's not as simple as that, but yeah.
Sure. I hope that answers your question, but please feel free to follow up with another question if it doesn't. Ken Gibbs had a question here, which I think the focus of this presentation is quite a lot on the international aspect, but obviously a key kind of distinctive element about the project is it a focus on the divergence between the four nation states for the four home nations. What do you think, have those four home nations learned from each other and how they develop their modes of dispute resolution, and could they learn more from each other?
I think there's definitely potential to learn from each other, and I know certainly in England there's talk of creating sort of a housing court that's not too dissimilar from the tribunal that's been developed in Scotland. And I think, you know, there's certainly opportunities to learn from each other. For example, if we are looking at the tribunal in Scotland, saying in what ways has it, you know, from what we can tell so far, improved or facilitated dispute resolution, and in what ways might some access barriers remain, and how can we avoid making the same mistakes, you know? And as I talked about, the continuing complexity that is associated with submitting claims to the tribunal. And I know I've spoke to someone and says, you know, actually the people that are experiencing digital exclusion also might experience difficulties in accessing a system that's digital by default, where the auxiliary services aren't necessarily super visible or well, you know, well advertised, you know. So I think there's different things like that we could definitely learn from each other. Yeah, if that answers the question.
Yeah, and then sort of focusing, I suppose, on the international element. I mean, Lisa Garnham's come up with the question, sort of saying, you know, to what extent are the kind of the effectiveness of these particular forms of alternative dispute resolution, and I suppose the popularity of them, to what extent is that conditional on the kind of the factors in that, structural factors in that country, such as the prevalence of private renting, relative demographics of the landlords versus the tenant, the reason for becoming landlords and tenants, you know, how to what extent do those structural factors affect kind of the suitability and the choice of dispute resolution mechanism?
I think that's, you know, that's a very important question. As I mentioned before, you know, I think because of those sort of structural differences, it's not possible for us to say that any of these case studies would necessarily operate well within a UK context. But certainly, I think as a first step, what we would want to be doing is learning about, you know, so what's the current situation here? What's the prevalence in different housing disputes? What are the kind of contextual factors in each nation? And then looking at the range of different dispute resolution approaches and methods which are available. So rather than, you know, and saying, well, how, you know, to what extent might that be appropriate for our particular context? So I wouldn't necessarily advocate that one of these models, you know, we try and kind of pick that up and put it in. Certainly in the Republic of, you know, not Republic of Ireland, in New Zealand, I think New Zealand it provides an excellent example of where sort of these structural factors will play a key role in how successful dispute resolution system will be. So in New Zealand, it's a housing market that's actually not too dissimilar from a lot of the UK in terms of it's characterised by a high level of unaffordability. There's insecurity of tenure, so they have the equivalent to no fault evictions, and then, you know, and there are sort of concerns that have been voiced by, you know, academics and practitioners and others to say, you know, because of these wider structural factors that can limit the ability of people to access this dispute resolution system, particularly where the, you know, the decisions can then be publishable, they can be available online, and, you know, landlords can then look them up. So I think the key learning as well from that case study is that this success, you know, the development of a dispute resolution and how likely it is to be effective or successful cannot be separated from the wider context of the wider system in which it is operating. That's what I would say.
And when these alternative forms of dispute resolution are introduced, does it tend to lead to an increase in complaints because people feel more accessible, or?
I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Okay, no worries. So the other question. There's another question here from Tim at Positive Action. Do you have any information about how quickly alternative dispute resolution mechanisms achieve resolution, and how much capacity is needed to guarantee that?
I mean, I think what you'd have to look at, you know, each specific dispute resolution mechanism. You know, like I said, they each have sort of the different processes and evidence base and strengths and weaknesses. But certainly, I'm trying to see if I have. Certainly, in terms of mediation, sort of savings and costs and time are widely cited as key measures of success. So I couldn't give you, you know, exact figures from it takes on, you know, on average this many weeks. But certainly there's been studies that have been carried out. I know there was an evaluation in Birmingham that was carried out that compared a mediated cases against a control group of non-mediated cases and found evidence that mediation can lead to quicker resolution. So I think, I mean, I do, there's a large international review of sort of the outcomes and successes around mediation specifically. So if you were interested in that, I can certainly send that on, but I would be very difficult for me to say off the top of my head, yeah, it should necessarily take this number of weeks. But
and when that mediation occurs, is it typically an exchange of? I mean, it's obviously it varies dramatically, I'm sure, but from country to country, from case to case. But is it typically an exchange of money, or is it kind of one person agrees to drop a demand, or is it?
Not necessarily, and I think that's supposed to be one of the key benefits that's associated with ADRs, is that it offers a wider range of potential outcomes of solution. That's what's available through the courts, you know, and sometimes it can be an apology what people are after. You know, it's one example, you know, that people, you know, and that feeling that they're actually being heard and the person understands where they're coming from, and offering kind of an apology. That could be, you know, that could be one solution. Yeah, there could be financial. It could be, you know, I don't know, if there's rent arrears that people could come to a, you know, rent repayment agreement, you know, plan. There's a huge number of potential outcomes that can be achieved through different forms of ADR. And that's the thing, it has the ability to be flexible, to be creative, you know, and a lot of that is down to, you know, the details of the individual dispute and the skills of the individual mediator, but you're not kind of just limited to, you know, financial compensation, for example. That's, you know, what you'd usually be able to get through the courts. So.
There's a quick question here from Carl Mack. Is it the case studies the case studies you talked about, are they all solely focused in the private rental sector? There's nothing, this rental sector is completely different, or is that also implicated in these processes?
Say that again, are they all?
So
sorry,
are these
I
all
didn't hear
into the private rental sector, or is the social rental sector also involved?
No, the first one was related to was for condominium disputes, which is actually a type of home ownership in Canada, which accounts for 50% of property ownership in Canada. So, and small claims disputes, and I can't remember what else the tribunal covers, but those are the kind of the two main areas. The I don't know about the other two. The other two, private rental sector, whether they actually cover social rented housing disputes, I'm not too sure. But I think those were specifically designed disputes for, you know, in the private rental sector. But yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
I mean, but that's sort of one of the key, you know, the key differences across I know, particularly in England anyway, you know, social housing providers have to sign up for rescue, don't they? So there's actually, in terms of what mechanisms are currently available for people renting in different tenures, I think dispute resolution is slightly better actually for people that are renting from social housing providers in England than they are from the private rental sector, in terms of there being mechanisms other than courts and tribunals. You know, once there's sort of that mandatory requirement to sign up to a redress scheme, then there should at least be, you know, a course of action somewhere that you can go to before courts and tribunals. If that's your only option, then it's just going to mean that so many people it's not an option for so many people for the reasons that I described earlier. But.
there's a few people have kind of drawn um, have suggested other examples, both in the UK of sort of places which are places or instances where dispute resolutions being alternative forms of dispute resolution are being advanced. So one of them is Owen Oliver. Apologies if I've got your name wrong there. Has referred to the ACAS, the role of ACAS in employment tribunals in England and Wales, as a potential comparator within in England and Wales. Owen Oliver's the same participants also mentioned in Portsmouth they're developing an agreement between private landlords associations and city council to develop a mediation service, and they're looking for funding for MHCLG. And in Northern Ireland, the Housing Rights and Northern Ireland are also looking at developing a free mediation service.
But that's actually the Housing Rights one. The other two, I mean, that'd be very interested to hear more about those two. I didn't have a chance to cover them in the report. There's potentially loads of examples and different areas of law to look at, so I didn't have a chance to look at those. But yeah, it'd be interesting to hear more. In Housing Rights, that service is mentioned in the report. That's only I believe they're free. The pilot service has only been in operation since December last year, so very, very early days. But an interesting development, because I would say, actually, I think Housing Rights is in the room, that they wouldn't disagree with me in saying that, or anyone from Northern Ireland, in saying that actually options for resolving disputes, private rented sector housing disputes in Northern Ireland is particularly stark compared to the rest of the UK. So that development of this pilot mediation service is quite exciting, in terms of there's not kind of like anything else other than the court. There's no sort of informal mechanism, no tribunal or housing panel or anything really. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the outcomes of that service will be, in terms of, does it offer a quicker, easier means of resolving disputes, and how do we come to those figures, and measuring satisfaction on different levels that would be comparable with the international literature. So I would recommend that service actually, and it looks at what are the main, I'm sure they're already doing this, but looking at the main outcomes which are generally measured and cited within the international literature, because there's a fair mediation is the most well-researched ADR mechanism. And that's fantastic. Then if you're developing a mediation service as an evidence base that you can compare your results against, then actually some guidance in regards to what you should be looking at in terms of key outcome measures, and indeed but I think something that, I don't know what the right word is perhaps a little bit unfortunate, that often this debate is framed in terms of mediation and litigations. That when we talk about ADR, people say, the other mechanisms don't necessarily come into the discussion. And I think there's a little bit of a shame, because when ADR was developed and the results, it offers lots of different means of resolving disputes, and we can, we have this kind of whole pick and mix box, and I think if, as, particularly government here in England and is looking at resolving dispute resolution in private rented sector, I would suggest, perhaps giving consideration to different mechanisms as well, seeing what's out there, and what might work best in this context with the sort of different structural challenges and contexts in which we're working.
Great. Well, I think I'll just finish with one kind of last topical question from Craig, who's sort of asked, in light of the coronavirus, which is probably, and the kind of uncertainty and lack of clarity around what the sort of rights of tenants are and what's happening. Do you think we'll see a spike in the amount of disputes between tenants and landlords? A slightly speculative question, sorry. And do you think, how do you think alternative dispute resolution could help on it, or if at all?
Oh gosh, that's I knew someone would ask something related.
You have to blame Craig.
I think absolutely there's likely to be an increase, in disputes. I mean, the housing law is complex enough as it is, and it's being developed now. There's all these kind of exemptions and new regulations and new laws being brought out at such an incredible pace, and and I think there's bound to be a number. There's bound to be a number of disputes. I think that's, that goes without saying. I don't know, the role for ADR. I mean, because we don't have that now, as you know, it's not embedded within our dispute resolution landscape, you know, as an accessible alternative, you know. But I'm sure there's a lot of voluntary organizations and other third parties that will be providing in their own way alternative dispute resolution. I actually think you'll find alternative dispute resolution being provided by these different services, you know, in response to the growing number of disputes will probably increase. And maybe there's key learning that we can gain from that as well. You know, it's not something that I've had a lot of chance to engage with in this presentation or indeed in the report, but actually, you know, what are the challenges and successes of these different organizations that are, you know, such as Citizens Advice Bureau and Shelter, that are providing, you know, dispute resolution, where sort of the more formal mechanisms fall short or fail or not accessible. So I'm really not good at answering speculative questions off the cuff, so no, but yeah, it's yeah, I don't know, we'll see. It's all, yeah, my mind's just.
Craig's apologised, and rightly so. I'm just the messenger. Thanks very much, Jennifer. If you have any, I think there's a couple maybe questions that we haven't had a chance to answer. If you would like to get an answer to those, please just email myself or Jennifer, and we'll respond as fast as possible. And so thanks so much, Jennifer, for giving the presentation. Thank you all for joining. We're going to have I think we're going to have a couple more webinars planned in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on our weekly newsletter and sign up for it if you haven't already, and follow us on Twitter.